Hello. This lecture is about participation, and particularly participation in the American political system. I think we started this semester early on and talked a little bit about whether or not America was truly a democracy. At the time, and in that lecture, we talked specifically about how we're not a pure democracy because we don't vote for every single piece of legislation that affects us. We are, in fact, a representative democracy, which means that American citizens have the option to vote for someone who will represent them and govern in their interests. But there is another half to that question of whether or not America is a democracy. And that is that if we understand the word democracy to mean government by the people, then that does kind of assume that the people participate in their governance. Increasingly, over the last couple of decades, people have started to call into question the extent to which Americans participate in their own governance. And it does raise the very real question. If people don't participate in democracy, is it still a democracy? So before we can really address this question, it might be helpful to talk about what we mean by political participation. And political participation is generally defined as a way of influencing public policy and leadership. Usually the most easy way that we think about when we think about political participation is voting. That is, after all, the way that we elect representatives, the way that laws get made, and so on. But it's important to realize that that is not the sum total of political participation. There are lots of ways in which people can participate in the political system, and people do these to varying extents. What I would like to do in this lecture is to talk about some of the major ways in which people can participate in the political system, and talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each of these ways of participating. As I said, the first way of participating that probably springs to mind when I talk about participating in a democracy is voting. The advantage of voting and using that as an avenue of participating in the political process is that it is probably the most direct way of changing leadership or retaining it. Remember that when you're voting between usually at least two candidates, and so you generally have the option of either change the leadership or retain it. Another advantage of voting as a means of trying to influence the political process is that this is the most common, most recognized, and most valued way of participating in the political process. That is, that everybody recognizes the right to vote. If you want to sort of talk about, if you talk to a legislator or something like that, one of the ways that you can sort of influence that legislator is to say, well, I vote, and this is a very important way to sort of consider how I participate or how I vote. It's also valued in other ways as well. For a long time there was this standard question of, if you don't vote for leaders, then you really shouldn't complain about them. Voting is a valuable way of influencing the system. That said, people have sort of pointed out that there are some disadvantages to using voting, at least as using voting as your only means of participation. The first and simplest is that voting can be confusing. There are numerous candidates who represent numerous things, and sometimes the candidates that are running for office in a particular election cycle may not actually be talking about the things that are most important to you. Voting can be confusing because in some cases multiple candidates will stand for the same issue or claim to. And sometimes things aren't always as they seem to be. Another disadvantage to voting as a sole means of influencing the political process or participating in it is that because so many people vote, it's easy for individuals to feel that their voice is not heard. This is especially true because at the end of the day, nobody knows why you voted for the person that you did. If you vote for candidate Smith during his or her campaign may have taken issues on everything from, treating animals humanely to tax issues to school systems to defense. And when candidate Smith wins, all candidate Smith will know is that that person got so many votes. They won't know whether it was ultimately their stance on taxes or schools or defense which caused them to win. Finally, there's sort of the question of whether when you vote, you're doing what's known as prospective voting or retrospective voting. Are you voting based on the last 2 or 4 or 6 years and wanting a change, or are you voting based on the coming 2 or 4, 6 years and hoping that whatever will happen will continue to happen? There are those who talk about whether or not voting is a time commitment. And some people sort of say, well, voting may be the most popular way of being politically active, but in the grand scheme of things, it's also not something that you necessarily need to invest a lot of time into. It takes very little time to vote, but on the other hand, it takes a while to know the candidates and the issues. There is no way of guaranteeing that the person walking into a polling station necessarily knows everything about all the various issues. And people have sort of said, well, maybe this is one of the disadvantages to voting in the political system, that almost anyone can vote regardless of whether they have well thought out opinions or not. This then is a nice segue into sort of the second way that people can participate in the political process. And that, quite simply, is being informed. Being informed is rather important in a democracy, at least I'm sure all the political science professors in the world would argue so. Because without necessarily knowing what's going on, it's very hard to be an engaged and active part of the political process. And the advantage of being informed, reading a variety of news sources or being exposed to a variety of news sources, maybe just listening to different radio stations in the car, talking to people, finding out about issues, the advantage of that is that it can take as much or as little time as you want it to. I know people who seriously sit down and read 2 or 3 different newspapers every day, or at the very least have subscriptions to 2 or 3 different major news magazines that they read through cover to cover. Some even make a point of sort of subscribing to international newspapers or international magazines, like The Economist, or reading the newspaper in French or in German or in Spanish if they've done that, just so that they also get a perspective from outside the United States. For other people, being informed is as easy as simply turning on the local news station on their drive in to work every day, or listening to NPR. So the amount of time that it takes to be informed is sort of often considered one of its advantages. It can take, it can fit into whatever priority you give it. The disadvantage to being informed, thinking of it as a way of participating in the political process, is it doesn't really feel like you're doing anything. Being informed is on some levels just a very passive thing, that unless you take this knowledge that you're accumulating and do something with it, you're simply being very informed. The next way in which a person can participate in the political process is to be an active participant in political parties or in politics in general. And this doesn't necessarily need to be something that's partisan or one-sided or on a particular issue. You can be active in the political process while being very intentionally not part of any political party. There are groups like the League of Women Voters or VISTA that go around and register voters, and regardless of who those people are going to vote for, but simply believing that it's important to sort of foster the political process and have as many people vote as possible. I have a very good friend of mine who volunteers her time in every election year to be an election judge. And all that means is that she sits at the desk and helps people check in. And if there is someone who has, say, a visual impairment or other reason why it would be difficult for them to vote, she volunteers to help that person vote. And she thinks that's very important to her. Being active in the political process has one very simple advantage, and that is that it is helping in one of the most crucial elements of a democracy. If you don't have someone out registering voters so that people can vote, if you don't have someone checking voters in to make sure that the elections proceed fairly, it's very easy to just let democracy start to crumble. There are, however, disadvantages to this system. One is that it is a very set time commitment. Going out and registering voters, for example, might not work if you've got a very busy schedule. Voter registrations tend to happen on Saturdays. If you work in a job that's very active on Saturdays, being someone who registers voters is probably not a good way for you to participate. Another one of the disadvantages for at least some people is that being active in the political process generally means that you're supposed to help everyone and not just the side that you like. It means that you have to register voters regardless of whether you have a sense that they're going to support your candidate or not. And while it is true that a lot of people who work for political parties do set up the voter registration drives, in fact, that's actually how I registered to vote when I lived in Connecticut, was somebody came knocking on my door campaigning for a particular candidate, but also registered me to vote at the same time. That person who knocked on my door would have registered me to vote regardless of whether I supported their political party or their candidate. And in fact, I believe did register me to vote, even though I did not definitely commit to voting for their candidate. Another way of participating in the political process is to be engaged in community activities. That can be anything like working for Habitat for Humanity, where you're actively helping someone get housing. It might be something like being volunteering at a library or helping clean up a local park. This does serve as political participation for a couple of reasons. First, it is a way of sort of meeting others in the community, and it also helps sort of engage other people. It engages people and builds up the community. In fact, one of the advantages of this type of political participation is that in many cases you are helping directly to solve the problem that is of issue to you. If having informed children and informed citizenry is important to you, volunteering at the library is one way to sort of make sure that the library is available so that little kids learn to read and other people have an opportunity to read newspapers and become better involved. If being able to sort of enjoy nature is important to you, cleaning up a hiking trail at the local park is a way of making sure that that particular trail remains open and safe for everybody. Another advantage to participating in community activities is that it is usually something that you do in a group, which means that it gets you out and interacting with others in your community. It provides companionship and camaraderie. I once worked at a Habitat for Humanity house and got to know all kinds of people who lived in other neighborhoods in the city where I lived. People that I wouldn't have known otherwise, but that I got to know, and we had a great time that Saturday. There are disadvantages to participating in community activities. One, and it's a rather simple one, is that participating in community activities is not always glamorous. It is no lie that the blister I got working on the Habitat for Humanity house did not go away for at least 3 weeks. Something like cleaning up a hiking trail can get you very muddy and might get you covered in all kinds of things that you don't necessarily want to be covered in. The perhaps more serious downside to participating in community activities is that your efforts to improve a particular area or a particular situation can probably be easily thwarted by people with political clout or money. One example that I can think of is a community garden in New York City. There was in New York City, which is of course densely populated and doesn't have a whole lot of green space, about 2 decades ago a building was raised and there was this big empty lot. And finally a group of people got together and said, well, you know, having a big empty lot in the middle of our block is not particularly attractive. It's a little bit dangerous, kind of sketchy people are hanging out there. And they petitioned the local area to get a community garden. And then they rented out little plots and everyone could grow their own vegetables, tomatoes or flowers or whatever they wanted. But it became a place where a whole lot of people in the community could hang out on a Saturday, get to know each other, raise vegetables, improve their own, eat some more healthier food. This community garden continued to exist for probably about 15 or 20 years because everybody enjoyed it. Until one day somebody decided that that piece of property where this community garden had been working all the time was probably worth a lot of money, and managed to convince the local neighborhood council to sell that piece of property to, it turned out to be a real estate developer, and that real estate developer built a, I believe it was a condominium on it. The point being that that real estate developer had a lot of money, had a fair bit of political clout, and convinced the neighborhood, the local community that, it could generate more in tax money by having this be a condominium than it was generating in goodwill for the neighborhood by having it just lie fallow and be a community garden. Which actually kind of leads to the fifth way in which people can participate in the political process. And this is by participating in interest groups. We'll talk a little bit more about interest groups later on in this particular unit. But interest groups are basically groups of people who come together to work on and make people aware of an issue that is of interest to them. There are a variety of these, and like I said, we'll talk more about them later. There are some advantages to participating in interest groups. Some of the most simple is that one of them is that, once again, participating in an interest group, like simply being informed or other things, allows you to choose your level of participation. You can be the volunteer in the interest group that just, shows up once a month to go and stamp some envelopes and put things in the mail, or you can be the person who commits to every day sending out an e-newsletter or updating the website to make sure people know what's going on. You can choose how much you participate in what you do because it's a volunteer organization. One of the other advantages to participating in interest groups is it helps you be more informed, especially in something that's of interest to you. Interest groups gather information which they then disseminate, so it lets you know things like what else is going on that involves this issue. It helps you find out what's going on in other parts of the country, and it helps you know when legislators or when something is about to happen in the government that's going to affect this issue. You will probably be one of the first people to know about it. And, of course, combining with others who share your enthusiasm about this issue increases your clout, your power, because you can sort of say you represent a group of people who are interested, and it allows you to learn from others, so that you can learn sort of if from people in other states who are tackling similar issues. You can also learn from the experiences of what has worked better for this type of interest group. The disadvantage to participating in interest groups is that participating in interest groups often costs money. There's generally an association fee or something else associated with participating in an interest group, and these generally go to things like putting out newsletters or helping people, stay informed. People have also sort of argued about whether or not being part of an interest group always counts as participation. If I send my membership fee in to be part of the Society of Informed Activists of America, and all I do is write a check once a year, I never read their newsletter, I never write a letter, I never do anything else, am I really participating? The Society of Informed Activists of America would of course argue that it is, because that gives them the power to say that they have a large membership when they go and represent me on Congress. But people have sort of said, well, you know, there's no real way of knowing how strong and how active the membership is. So now we're going to talk about we're going to sort of start ratcheting up things that might take a little bit more time and a little bit more effort, but and a little bit more sort of risk in order to sort of participate in the political system. One of the ways that one can participate is by attending meetings. This can be meetings of almost anything, from the simple sort of school board meeting to a city council meeting. Congress regularly, if they're considering new legislation or checking up on regulations, will have sort of public hearings which anyone can attend. There are advantages to going to these things, and the first and most obvious perhaps is that this is your chance to make your voice heard by those making decisions. You will have an opportunity to speak, you will have an opportunity to listen to others who are speaking on this issue. The disadvantage, as anyone who's ever watched too many episodes of The Simpsons knows, is that while it is your chance to make your voice heard at a public meeting, everyone else has the same chance. And so I can think of lots of Simpsons episodes, for example, where the entire town comes out for a meeting and one Simpson says something and then someone else has a very persuasive but ultimately idiotic idea, and that person is heard as well. The other disadvantage is that this type of participation does require a little bit of research. If you are particularly committed to one issue, you need to know when the town council will be addressing this issue. I'll use the school board because that's perhaps an easier example. You know, if you are particularly interested in raising raising the standards for the football team or something like that, well, not every meeting of the school board is going to discuss the athletic department. You have to know when that's going to be discussed, and you have to be able to go out on that day. Another way to make sure that your opinions are heard, and this would be the seventh way of participating, is to make your opinion heard via the media. This can mean something like, you know, writing a letter to the editor of a newspaper, or commenting on a blog, or, you know, being interviewed by a radio station, or perhaps calling into a radio station. The advantage of participating in this way is that it will get your opinion out probably in a lot more coherent and persuasive form than it would otherwise. If you're participating in a town meeting, you're going to be sort of in the middle of a whole lot of things and responding off the cuff to something. If you're writing a letter to the editor in particular, or writing on a blog, more often than not, you've had the time to sort of formulate what it is you want to say, and what gets published is usually some form of that actual well-thought-out speech. The disadvantages of making your opinion heard via the media is that, at least with credible media sources, it's very hard to be anonymous. You can't just go and say, I think that this proposed bill is a bad idea, without putting your name to it. Most legitimate, unless there's a really good reason why you should remain anonymous, most legitimate media sources will not print anonymous letters. That doesn't mean that it won't always happen. For example, if you know of something that is endangering people's safety, but for reasons of confidentiality you can't betray that trust, you can be anonymous, but you will still have to explain to the person, the editor of the newspaper or so on, who you are and why you need to be anonymous. Another disadvantage to making your opinion heard via the media is that, once again, it doesn't always feel like you're doing very much. That if you're addressing a particularly hot topic, as I once put it, the louder voices carry. The people who are more respected by society for whatever reason tend to have a lot more weight in the public debate, especially in the media. The final way of participating in the political process that I'd like to talk about in this lecture is participating in protests and demonstrations. We've probably all been a little bit more familiar with protests in the last year thanks to the Occupy movement than we were in years past. And what the Occupy movement perhaps showed are some of the advantages, but also some of the disadvantages. The advantage of a protest or a demonstration is that it allows people it allows your opinion to be heard in a very big way. It shows that there's not just that you don't speak just for yourself, but that you speak for a large number of people who are protesting with you. Another advantage to this form of political participation, quite honestly, is the companionship. You get to meet people who share your thoughts and ideas. And if you're talking about an issue that's particularly contentious or particularly falls into sort of a particular social spectrum, it may seem like you're all alone about your issue. So the companionship can be important. That said, as I said, our experience with Occupy in the last year or so has also sort of shown some of the negatives of protests and demonstrations. And one of the simplest is that protests are not generally viewed as a positive way of influencing the political process. People don't go and say, look at, for example, strikers standing in front of a factory and say, wow, there are some really committed individuals who are influencing the political process. Generally, when people look at strikers or others, the comments are more in the lines of, hey, there are some rabble-rousers, there are people who don't have anything better to do, there are people who are trying to create trouble, and so on. This is not a form of political participation that is generally viewed well by society. And the larger problem, perhaps, with protests and demonstrations is that, and again, Occupy sort of exemplified this, protests and demonstrations sometimes get out of control. And when I said, yeah, you put 3,000 people together on a public square, and it's very easy for one or two bad apples to sort of create a whole lot of trouble that then gets put onto the group as a whole, which means that the demonstration, even if it was intended to be peaceful, winds up having a very negative connotation, which then carries on to the group. I say that, and yet at the same time, I sort of do want to pause and acknowledge that much as we've been talking about Occupy, the idea of doing a protest or a demonstration in support of some sort of political action is becoming increasingly common, and so has less of a negative stigma attached to it than it did, say, 30 years ago. Increasingly, even political leaders will stage rallies. I'm thinking a couple of years ago when I was living in Washington, D.C., the Ku Klux Klan was going to come and stage a protest, and the congressional delegate from Washington, D.C. decided that what she would do was organize a counter-protest. And so while the Ku Klux Klan was rallying on one side of Washington and doing so remarkably unsuccessfully, as I recall, a large number of people gathered around the Washington Monument at the behest of a politician from Washington, D.C. All of the activities I've described in this lecture, ranging from voting to being informed, being active in the political process, being active in political parties, participating in voluntary community activities, participating in interest groups, attending meetings, making your opinion heard, and even participating in a protest or a demonstration, all of these activities will build some social capital. The amount that they build will vary from activity to activity, from group to group, but all of them increase the investment in society and keep us from being sort of these little isolated atoms in society. Your book does point out that, for a long time people worried, and there were entire books written about whether or not American political participation was on the decline. And so what I'm going to leave you with is that sort of very real question. Do you think political participation is on the decline? Do you think that, people are less informed than they were, less likely to go volunteer, less likely to write into media or other important news sources, news outlets? Or do you disagree, and do you think that people are just participating in other ways? And most significantly, what does that mean for the American democratic process? That's all I have for you today. We will continue in this unit to talk about other ways in which people can participate, and in particular looking very specifically at ways in which people do participate and what their effects are. Hope you're having a good day. Goodbye.